I came home from the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon. My best mate of 43 years was in my living room with my wife. I saw the bottle of massage oil on the coffee table and the way her dressing gown was pooled on the floor. I went quietly back out to the ute, drove to the workshop behind my shed, and came back with a bottle of marine epoxy that looked almost exactly the same. 2 hours later, when the ambos finally arrived in our quiet street in the Adelaide Hills, the senior paramedic had to step outside 3 times because he couldn't keep a straight face. My name is Hamish Whitlock. I'm 64 years old, a retired carpenter. And until that Tuesday in October, I would have told you I was the luckiest bloke in South Australia. I had a paid-off house on 3 acres in Stirling, a workshop full of timber I'd been saving for 30 years, a wife I'd loved since 1981, and a daughter who'd given me 2 grandkids that thought I hung the moon. I had a fishing boat, a dog called Bruce, and a routine. Tuesdays I drove down to Mitre, 10 inches Mount Barker, picked up whatever I needed for the week's projects, and stopped in at the bakery for a pie before heading home. Margaret, my wife, knew that. She'd been packing my Tuesday thermos for 41 years. That's the bit that still cuts deepest even now. She knew exactly what time I'd be home. They both did. Let me tell you about Margaret first, because if I don't, none of the rest will make sense. We met at a barn dance in the Barossa Valley in 1982. She was a primary school teacher, 23 years old, with the kind of laugh that made strangers turn around in cafes. I was a second-year apprentice, with sawdust permanently in my hair. We were married within 18 months. Our daughter Felicity came along in 1986. Margaret kept teaching until her knees went bad. Then she did relief work. Then she retired 5 years ago and threw herself into the garden, the church choir, and a book club that met every second Wednesday. And my mate. His name was Owen Tregarth. We met as apprentices at the same building company in 1981. Both of us 19, both of us cocky as hell. He was the best man at my wedding. I was the best man at his. When his wife Beverly died of cancer in 2018, I was the one who organized the wake and stood up to speak when his voice gave out. He had no kids of his own, so he'd been an uncle to Felicity her whole life. He came to every birthday, every school play, every Christmas dinner. After Beverly passed, he came over for Sunday roast every single week without fail. Margaret made enough food for 3. Owen always brought a bottle of Shiraz from his own cellar. 6 years of Sunday roasts. 6 years of him sitting at our table, laughing at my jokes, helping Margaret with the dishes, falling asleep in my recliner watching the cricket. 6 years. How long had it actually been going on? That's the question that wouldn't let me sleep for weeks afterwards. Was it from the start, when he was widowed and lonely, and Margaret was being kind? Was it from before Beverly died? Was it from before Felicity was born? I'd lie awake at 3 in the morning trying to do the maths backwards, looking for the moment where I'd been a fool without knowing it. I never found it. Some questions don't have answers you can live with. That Tuesday I'd gone to Mount Barker like always. But the bloke at the trade counter told me my order of decking screws hadn't come in yet. So I was back on the road by 11:30, instead of 1. I didn't ring Margaret to tell her. Why would I? I was just coming home. I stopped at the bakery, picked up 2 pies, thinking I'd surprise her with lunch. The driveway curves around behind a row of greviouss before it reaches the house, so you can't see the front door from the road. I parked next to Margaret's Subaru, grabbed the pies, and walked up the path. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. Bruce, our old Kelpie, was lying on the veranda and didn't even lift his head. He knew Owen's smell as well as he knew mine. That should have been my first clue looking back. The dog wasn't barking because the visitor wasn't a stranger. I heard them before I saw them. Not what you'd think. Not at first. Just laughter from the back of the house. Margaret's laugh, the one I'd fallen for in 1982, and Owen's voice, low, saying something I couldn't make out. I assumed he'd drop by to pick up a tool or return a book. I called out hello. The laughter stopped. Just stopped, like someone had pulled a plug. I walked through the kitchen, through the dining room, towards our bedroom at the back of the house. The door was closed. I could hear movement inside, hurried movement, the kind of rustling that doesn't sound innocent no matter how you try to interpret it. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 seconds. And then I did something I'm still not sure was wise. I didn't open the door. I didn't shout. I turned around, walked silently back through the house, out the front door, and back to my ute. I sat in the driver's seat with 2 cooling pies on the passenger seat and I cried. Not for long. Maybe 2 minutes. Then I wiped my face with my sleeve and started thinking. Because thinking is what carpenters do. We measure. We plan. We don't swing the hammer until we know exactly where the nail's going. I drove around to the back of the property where my workshop is, parked the ute behind it so it wouldn't be visible from the house, and I got my old camcorder out of the cupboard, where it had been gathering dust since Felicity's wedding in 2009. Battery still had charge. Memory card still in. I also picked up something else. You see, I'd been working on a job restoring an old wooden sailboat for a bloke down at Goolwa. Marine epoxy is a particular sort of glue. It cures hard as steel, bonds to almost anything, and once it sets, you don't get it off without a chisel and a lot of patience. I had a small bottle of it in my workshop. The slow cure kind. In a clear plastic squeeze bottle that looked, to anyone who wasn't paying attention, almost identical to the bottle of massage oil Margaret kept on her dressing table, the one Owen had clearly seen fit to bring out into the open before I'd surprised them. I won't pretend I didn't know what I was doing. I knew. Every step. I told myself I was just teaching them a lesson. I told myself nothing too bad would happen, that any sensible adult would notice the texture difference before things progressed too far. I told myself a lot of things. But the honest truth is, I was a man who'd just had his entire life pulled out from under him, and I wanted them to feel a fraction of what I was feeling. Shame, exposure, the understanding that you cannot pretend this didn't happen. I crept in through the laundry door, which doesn't squeak. I could hear them in the bedroom now, no longer being quiet about it. The bathroom is right next to our bedroom. I slipped in, swapped the bottle on the vanity for the bottle from my workshop, set the camcorder up on the towel rack at an angle that just caught the bedroom doorway through the open bathroom door, pressed record, and got out the same way I came in. I drove back down the road, parked at the lookout where Margaret and I used to take Felicity for picnics, and I waited. I rang Felicity from the lookout. She lives in Glenelg with her husband, an accountant named Stuart Brennan, and our 2 grandkids. I told her I needed her to come home. I told her something had happened and I didn't want to say it over the phone. She started crying before I'd even said anything specific. Daughters know. I drove back home at 1:45. I parked in the driveway, slammed the car door loudly, and walked up the path whistling. I let myself in, called out, "Just me, love." Got back early. Silence. I made a sandwich in the kitchen, took my time, opened a beer. I read the paper at the dining table for 20 minutes. The whole time I could hear, faintly, things happening in the bedroom. Whispered arguments. The thump of a body trying to move. At one point, what sounded distinctly like Owen swearing. When I finally walked down the hallway and tried the bedroom door, it was locked from the inside. I knocked. "Margaret? You all right in there?" There was a pause. "Hamish, just give me a minute. Sounds like you've been in there a while, love." "Are you sick?" Another pause. "I'm fine. Just resting. Want me to call Dr. Henderson?" No, please. Just give me a bit. I went back to the kitchen and rang the local fire brigade. I told them my wife was locked in the bedroom, and I thought she might be having a medical episode, but she wouldn't open the door. I told them I needed someone to break it open. Then I rang an ambulance for good measure. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. The first to arrive was a young constable, then 2 paramedics, then 3 blokes from the Sterling Fire Brigade, including a fellow named Damien, whose father I'd built a deck for back in 1996. I stood back, the picture of a worried husband, and let them work. They knocked and called out. They got no useful response. The senior paramedic eventually broke the lock with a kick that took 3 tries. What they found inside that room is something I'll carry with me until I die, and not in a way I'm proud of. My wife of 41 years and my best mate of 43 were on our marital bed, partially covered by a sheet, attached to one another. In a way that I won't describe in detail, because there's a limit to what an old man should put into words. The marine epoxy had done exactly what marine epoxy does. Damien, the firefighter, looked at the scene, looked at me, looked back at the scene, turned around, and walked straight out of the house. I could hear him laughing in the front yard. He wasn't the only one. The senior paramedic was a professional. He kept his composure mostly. He asked Margaret what had happened. She was crying too hard to answer. He asked Owen, who said something about a prank and a bottle, and someone tampering with their things. The paramedic asked, very gently, whose house this was, and Margaret had to admit it was hers. He asked who else lived there. She had to say her husband. He looked at me, standing in the doorway, with my arms crossed. Sir, do you know anything about this? I'd been rehearsing my line. I came home, and they were locked in there. I assumed she was unwell. I have no idea what they were doing in there together, or how they got like that. I'd love to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt sick. I felt like someone had hollowed me out with a melon baller and replaced my insides with broken glass. But I held my face still, because the alternative was breaking down in front of strangers, and I'd already done my crying in the ute. They had to take Margaret and Owen to hospital separately, still attached, on a single stretcher, covered with hospital blankets and as much dignity as the situation allowed, which wasn't much. The neighbors came out to watch. Mrs. Cawthorne from across the road stood on her veranda with her hand over her mouth. Old Mr. Demetriou from next door kept saying, "Goodness me, goodness me." The rumor mill in the Adelaide Hills works faster than the NBN. By the time I'd cleaned up the kitchen, half the village knew something extraordinary had happened at the Whitlock place. Even if they didn't yet know what. Felicity arrived at 5. I sat her down at the dining table, made her a cup of tea, and told her exactly what had happened. I left out the bit about the epoxy. I told her I'd come home, found them, called the authorities, and that her mother and Uncle Owen were currently at Mount Barker Hospital being separated by a team of doctors. I watched my daughter's face go through every color in the spectrum. Disbelief, horror, grief, anger. Then, finally, a strange flat calm. "Dad," she said, "are you sure?" "I'm sure, love." "How sure?" I told her about the camcorder. I told her there was footage, although I hadn't yet watched it myself, and frankly didn't intend to. She nodded slowly. She put her head in her hands for a long while. Then she stood up, walked to the bedroom doorway, looked at the broken lock and the rumpled bed, and walked back out without saying a word. That should have been the end of it. A clean break. A wronged man. A betrayed daughter. A wife and a mate facing the consequences of their choices. But this is not where the story ends, because betrayal of this kind is never simple, and the people who do it rarely accept their share of the blame quietly. What came next was worse than walking into that hallway. Margaret came home from the hospital 3 days later. The separation procedure had required minor surgery for both of them, and she walked with a careful gait for several weeks. Owen was kept longer due to complications I won't detail. By the time Margaret returned, I'd already moved my things into the spare bedroom and rung a solicitor in Adelaide named Patience Okonkwo, recommended by a bloke at the bowls club. I expected Margaret to be remorseful, to beg, to explain. Instead, she came home angry at me. "You did this," she said. The first words out of her mouth when I picked her up from the hospital. Not hello. Not sorry. Not a single tear of regret. "I came home early, Margaret. That's all I did. You knew. Somehow you knew. The bottle was different. I want to know what you did." I drove the rest of the way in silence. Felicity came over that evening, and that's when the second betrayal began, although I didn't see it for what it was at the time. My daughter, my Felicity, sat with her mother in the kitchen for 2 hours while I stayed in the workshop. When she came out to find me, she looked uncertain in a way I hadn't seen since she was 16 and had pranged my old Holden. "Dad," she said, "Mum thinks you're not well." "I'm fine, love. I'm dealing with it. She says you've been forgetting things, getting confused. She says she's been worried about you for months. She says." Felicity paused, struggling with it. "She says she thinks Owen came over because she was scared and didn't know who else to talk to." I stared at my daughter. I waited for her to laugh, to tell me she was kidding, to acknowledge that this was the most laughable invention any guilty woman had ever come up with. She didn't laugh. She looked worried. "Felicity," I said carefully, "I built that desk you're leaning against last winter. I run my own books. I drive into town 3 times a week. I am not losing my mind. Your mother is trying to save herself." "Dad, she's got documents." "What documents?" She wouldn't say. But over the next 10 days I found out. Margaret had been quietly building a case. She had notes she claimed to have written about my forgetfulness, notes dated months back. She had a letter from her cousin's husband, a GP in Adelaide who had never examined me in his life, suggesting I might benefit from a cognitive assessment. She had her book club friends ready to swear they'd noticed me being odd at a Christmas party. She'd been laying the groundwork, not for what happened, but for the day I might find out. She'd planned for this, or planned for some version of it. The preemptive defense of a woman who'd known for a long time what she was doing was wrong. Owen, recovered from his hospital stay, had moved in with a friend in Adelaide. But he wasn't quiet either. He rang Felicity. He told her, with great sympathy, that he was worried about me, that he'd come over that day because Margaret had called him crying about my behavior, that nothing improper had happened, that the situation was a misunderstanding, possibly He suggested Felicity look into power of attorney. He suggested a particular care facility he'd heard good things about, a place near Hondorf with a memory care wing, a care facility. They wanted to put me in a care facility. A man who'd built half the houses in Stirling. A man who'd just 2 weeks earlier finished restoring a 1,962 Holden ute in his shed. A man who could still recite the entire timber stock list in his workshop from memory. They wanted to lock me away so they could quietly divide my assets between them while I was deemed incompetent. My daughter, God help me, started to listen, not because she wanted to. I know that now. She listened because the alternative, that her mother of 58 years and her uncle Owen of 43 years had betrayed her father, had betrayed her, had been lying for who knew how long, was unbearable. The dementia story let her keep her family. The truth would burn it down. For 2 weeks I lived in a house where my daughter looked at me with wary eyes, where she watched me like she was waiting for me to forget where I was, where she made up reasons to stop by and check the milk wasn't sour and the stove wasn't on. Stuart, my son-in-law, came once and asked me very gently if I'd been to see my GP recently. When I told him I'd had a clean bill of health in May, he looked at me as if I'd just confirmed his suspicions. I rang Patience Okonkwo, my solicitor. I told her everything. The affair, the epoxy, the footage I'd recorded but hadn't watched, the sudden dementia narrative being constructed around me, the talk of care facilities. She listened without interrupting for 40 minutes. Then, she said one sentence that brought me back from the edge. "Mr. Whitlock, you are not the first man in this position, and the law in South Australia is on your side. But you need to move now, and you need to move carefully. Bring me the camcorder tomorrow morning." I did. I drove into the city the next day with the memory card in a padded envelope. Patience watched the footage in her office while I sat in the waiting room reading a 6-month-old copy of the Women's Weekly. She came out, sat beside me, and put her hand briefly on my arm. "It is unambiguous," she said. "It is dated and time-stamped. It is more than sufficient." She also asked me, professionally and seriously, what I had done with the bottle. I told her the truth. I told her I'd swapped it. I told her I knew that might have legal implications. She thought about it for a long time, and then she said, "Marine epoxy is a substance commonly stored in your workshop for legitimate purposes. Bottles look similar. The standard of intent required for a charge of bodily harm in this state is high, and any prosecution would have to weigh that against the matter on the camcorder. My advice, and I will only say this once, is that you do not volunteer information about the bottle to anyone other than me. Let your wife make whatever claims she wants to make. The footage is your shield." She got to work. She arranged a private cognitive assessment with a respected geriatric psychiatrist in North Adelaide, a Dr. Linnea Karvanen, who saw me within a week. The assessment took 3 hours. The report came back unambiguous. Cognition entirely intact. Memory excellent. Reasoning sharp. No indicators of any cognitive decline whatsoever. She wrote, in fact, that I was performing in the top decile for my age group. Patients filed for divorce on grounds of adultery, with full evidence attached. She moved to freeze the joint accounts. She wrote a formal letter to Felicity, copied to Stuart, advising them that any attempt to pursue power of attorney or guardianship over me would be vigorously contested and would be viewed by the court as elder abuse. She included Dr. Karvanen's report and a sealed envelope containing a description, but not a copy, of the video footage. That envelope is what broke it open. Felicity rang me on a Sunday afternoon. She was at home, the kids were at her in-laws, Stuart was out. She'd been crying. She had Patience's letter in front of her. "Dad," she said, "is there a video?" "There is a video, love. Have you watched it?" "No. I don't want to." Is it what Mum said it was? An accident?" I took a long breath. "Felicity, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Has any part of you actually believed I was losing my mind?" The silence on the line was the longest of my life. "No, Dad," she said finally. "Not really. I wanted to believe it, because the other thing was too." She broke off into sobs. "I know, love. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." She came over that evening. We sat in the workshop where it was warm and smelled of pine shavings, and I told her everything. I told her about the swap. I told her I wasn't proud of it. I told her about her mother's pre-prepared documents. I told her about Owen ringing Patience's office, asking about a financial settlement before I'd even filed for divorce. How his name was on Margaret's life insurance as a contingent beneficiary, a change made in 2021 that I had never been told about. "Dad, the insurance change. I know. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to get divorced. I'm going to keep my house, my workshop, and my self-respect. And I'm not going to let anyone take any of those things from me." She nodded. She wiped her face. She told me she'd been a fool, and I told her she'd been a daughter caught in the middle of a war her mother had started, and that I forgave her, even though she didn't need forgiving. We sat there until the sun went down behind the gum trees and Bruce came in and put his head on my knee. The divorce took 11 months. Margaret fought every step. She tried to claim half the value of the workshop, which I'd built myself in 1995 on land my father had left me before we married, and which my solicitor proved was properly excluded. She tried to claim spousal maintenance, which was rejected when patients produced bank statements showing Margaret had over $400,000 of her own in an account I'd never heard of, money she'd been quietly siphoning from joint accounts for nearly 15 years. The judge was not impressed. The final settlement gave me the house, the workshop, the boat, the ute, the dog, and slightly more than half the remaining joint assets, in recognition of Margaret's pre-existing private holdings and her conduct during the marriage. Owen was a different story. He didn't get off lightly. The local rumor mill had already done substantial damage to him in the Adelaide Hills, but it turned out his troubles ran deeper. The investigation into the insurance beneficiary change uncovered something else. He'd been borrowing money from Margaret for over 6 years, not small amounts. Over $200,000 in total, drip-fed from the joint account she'd been quietly building. He was bankrupt in everything but name. The Sunday roasts hadn't been about loneliness or friendship. They'd been about access to money and access to a woman whose husband was too trusting to count the silverware. When the bank statements came out in court, even Margaret's solicitor looked uncomfortable. He moved interstate. I heard he ended up in Townsville, working as a handyman at a caravan park. I haven't seen him since the day the paramedics carried him out of my house, and that's the last image of him I'll ever have, which suits me fine. Margaret took a small unit in Adelaide. She tried to maintain that she'd been the victim of a long marriage to a difficult man. But the story didn't take in our community. The book club asked her not to come back. The choir politely informed her the alto section was full. Her cousin, the GP who'd written the letter suggesting I needed a cognitive assessment, was the subject of a complaint by patients to the medical board for writing a clinical opinion on a patient he'd never examined. He was reprimanded. Her cousin no longer speaks to her. Felicity rebuilt her relationship with me slowly and properly. She brought the grandkids over every second weekend. Stuart, to his credit, came to me about 6 months after the dust settled and apologized for not having stood up for me sooner. He said he'd been afraid of getting it wrong. I told him I understood. We've fished together twice since then. I'd love to say I'm finished with the lessons of that Tuesday. I'm not. They keep arriving, even now, 2 years later. I'd like to share a few of them with you. Because if even one person hearing this is in a marriage where something doesn't feel right, or has a feeling about a friend that they keep talking themselves out of, I'd want them to listen. The first lesson is this. When something is wrong in your home, your body will know before your mind admits it. Margaret had been off for months, distant in small ways, quick to anger over nothing, disappearing for hours and being vague about where she'd been. I'd registered all of it, and I'd rationalized all of it, because the truth was unbearable. Don't do what I did. If your gut is telling you something, listen to it. Ask the question. Get the answer. Living with a lie costs you more than knowing the truth. Every single time. The second lesson is about evidence. I want to be careful here. I am not advising anyone to do what I did with the epoxy. That part of my story was the action of a man in shock who got lucky that no permanent harm came of it. And I will be honest with you that if I had it to do again, I would skip the swap and go straight to the camera. The camera is what saved me, not the prank. If you are in a position where you suspect betrayal, document it. Calmly, legally, with timestamps. The single most important thing I did that day was press record on a dusty old camcorder. Without that footage, I'd have spent a year fighting a story about my own dementia, and I might have lost. With it, the truth was undeniable. The third lesson is about your family of choice. Owen Tregarth was at our wedding. He held my newborn daughter. He spoke at my father's funeral. None of that meant anything. He was a man with a hollow center and the patience to drain a friend dry over 4 decades. The people you trust most are the people most capable of hurting you. And a long history is not the same as a good character. Watch how people treat strangers. Watch how they speak about people who can't hear them. That tells you more than any number of Sunday roasts. The fourth lesson, and the one I want you to carry with you, is about getting older. There is a particular cruelty in this country towards men of my age. We are assumed to be fading, confused, easily managed. The dementia trick Margaret tried to pull on me works because society half believes it about every man over 60. I want you to know that if you are an older man or you love one, your competence is yours to claim and to protect. Get your affairs in order before you need to. Have a solicitor you trust. Have a doctor who knows you. Have at least one person in your family who will believe you over anyone else. And do not ever let anyone tell you that what you are seeing with your own eyes is something other than what it is. The fifth and last lesson is the one I never expected to learn. I thought freedom would feel like an empty house. I thought, at 64, I'd been given a life sentence of solitude. I was wrong. The house is fuller now than it has been in years. Felicity comes over on Sundays. The grandkids stay weekends and have learned to use the lathe in the workshop. I started teaching woodworking classes at the Sterling Community Center on Thursday evenings. I have friends I didn't realize I had, men and women who showed up after the divorce, went through with casseroles, and offers to help and stories of their own. I have a woman named Constance who walks her Labrador past my driveway every morning at 7, and we've fallen into the habit of having a coffee on the veranda. I'm not in any hurry. I'm 64, not 16. But it turns out the heart doesn't retire just because you do. The Tuesday I came home from Mount Barker with 2 pies and lost my entire life, I thought I'd been destroyed. What had actually happened was that a structure I'd been holding up for years on the strength of my own goodwill had finally collapsed, and once the rubble cleared, I could see the sky. I see it every morning now from my veranda. I see it every evening from my workshop. I see it in my daughter's face when she pulls into my driveway with my grandkids in the back seat, waving like nothing was ever wrong. Because for them, in the world they live in, nothing is. The marine epoxy, in case you're wondering, is back on the shelf in my workshop, properly labeled, used only for boats. I keep it where I can see it, not as a trophy. As a reminder that there are moments in a man's life where he gets to choose between accepting a small dignity and accepting none at all. I chose mine. I'm not sorry. And if you're listening to this and you're at the edge of one of those moments yourself, I want you to know that on the other side of it, the sun still comes up over the Adelaide Hills, and the dog still wants his walk. And there is a life waiting for you that is yours, and yours alone, for the first time in a very long time. Take care of yourselves out there, and measure twice before you cut.